My name is Mike Gintz. I'm going to provide a little bit of information about the context behind the Eligibility APIs Initiative. So next slide, please, Alex. So yes, hello. My name is Mike Gintz. I'm a strategist and designer at 10x, pronouns he, him. And I'm here with my colleague, Alex, from 18F, same pronouns. 10x and 18F are both within the Technology Transformation Services within the General Services Administration. And Alex is working at 18F. I used to work at 18F and I now work directly at 10x. Next slide. We're here to share a demo from the Eligibility APIs Initiative, which was a federal government project funded by 10x and staffed by 18F. And I'm going to provide a little bit of introduction about just what we did. Next slide. Okay, so the Eligibility APIs Initiative was an experiment that we undertook. We wanted to research and explore the feasibility and the impact of writing benefits eligibility policy into code and demonstrate the results to federal agencies, to our 18F partner agencies that we were working with actively, and just to any other federal agencies that were watching as we deployed and as we blogged and released new information. We really wanted to know whether doing this rules as code approach would make policy more portable, more understandable, and more usable by different teams, perhaps between different programs, different jurisdictions, different levels of government, et cetera. Right now, federal eligibility policy is typically distributed in the form of super complex prose guidance in PDFs or printed materials. As Ariel noted, it's really dense. It's usually not functional code. We wanted to see if a rules as code approach could offer an improvement upon that practice. Next slide. So we built a supplemental nutrition assistance program pre-screener. This is SNAP. Food stamps is a colloquial term for it. We used a rules as code-based approach to build that screener. Our pre-screener used SNAP financial eligibility rules to determine whether an applicant was likely to be eligible for SNAP. And if the answer was yes, it calculated an estimated benefit amount for them. Next slide. So why did we make a SNAP pre-screener? Applying for benefits often takes a lot of time. It requires a lot of information. And pre-screeners are kind of an established approach to help make that a little bit more clear to the applicant before they endeavor to this kind of laborious process, whether it's going to be worth their time or not. But that said, initially we didn't actually really want to build a pre-screener. And this narrative that we're sharing today is a little bit of our journey through realizing that. We wanted to build a backend eligibility rules engine. We wanted to use our unique position as feds, digging into rules as code and into APIs. And we also wanted to use our access to fellow feds to push for a tool that would actually be part of the benefits application process itself. But what we discovered throughout were some good reasons why the appetite and the comfort level for that approach just wasn't quite there yet. So we pivoted towards a pre-screener as a way to test and prove out our ideas. Next slide, please. So the reason that we thought this would be effective is because a pre-screener is kind of a low risk way for us to explore whether we could use a rules as code approach to model the complexity of the SNAP eligibility rules and to see what kind of impact we'd get from doing so. We decided to work on SNAP specifically because we had existing relationships with the SNAP program and because we thought that the structural and the nature of the SNAP eligibility rules, especially how they varied across states, would be a really good test of whether our planned approach would work. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex to explain a little bit about how we did it.
All right. So how did we go about this? What did we optimize for? At the front, before we demo, I want to talk about a couple of things that we optimized for that are organized around sustainability. So as Mike mentioned at the beginning, we knew that this was an experiment. Experiments have limited time, limited funding. And we knew that because it was an experiment, that ultimately the real test of its value would be if others could use our work and carry it forward. And so we did a couple things up front. We invested a lot of time and energy in listening to stakeholders who expressed a need for a SNAP pre-screener within the SNAP legal aid and advocacy communities. And we also spent time essentially marketing our work to open source civic tech networks, sharing with folks that, hey, we're writing these SNAP rules as code, because we wanted to test if our code could create enough value for others to want to build on the code. In terms of technical choices, we decided to write our rules as code in JavaScript. We wanted to make it really easy for other organizations to use our rules as code logic and use our pre-screener on their own websites and be able to embed the functionality onto their own sites. So I'll walk you through some quick code tour and a quick demo step. So this is our GitHub repo of our Snap JavaScript prototype where we wrote out the rules as code. If you visit the repo, you can dig into the JavaScript that we wrote. And I think just to give you a flavor of the complexity, I want to take you to one file in this JavaScript code where we wrote a model for Snap's net income. So to be eligible for Snap, a household has to meet a net income test, a gross income test, and an asset test in many states. And as you can just see, even if you are not a coder yourself, as you can see from some of the JavaScript here, to find out the net income of a household for Snap is really complicated. Just at the front, you can see that we're calling a bunch of other little libraries we wrote to model many deductions that Snap has that will modify the amount a household would be eligible for. And if you look at some of the code, you might get a sense of how many inputs it takes to calculate an accurate net income for a Snap household. It involves the household size, their gross income, many deduction factors, whether the household includes someone who's elderly or disabled. So we hope that showing this JavaScript code can give you a little bit of a sense of the complexity of the rules here. So that's a tour of one half of our work, writing the rules as code in JavaScript. We also wrote code for a pre-screener that would call the rules as code library and use that to power a user-facing application that a household person could use to assess their eligibility for SNAP. So this is a link to the prototype pre-screener that we created to test out our ideas. If you run through the pre-screener really quick, it'll show you some of what we emphasized in our work. So let's say, for example, that this is a household with 3 people. It includes someone, it doesn't include anyone who is 60 or older. Everyone is a US citizen. And let's say that this is a household where someone's been laid off. Maybe there is no monthly income in the household. Maybe there's no monthly income from jobs or other sources. The household may have a small amount of resources on hand, but they still have costs which factor in. So for example, for some of the cost questions, let's say that there's, still got to pay rent. So we'll put in all these factors to show how the calculator works. A couple of things that we emphasized in building the calculator. It was really important for us to give this estimated benefit amount. We heard that was a differentiator, that some pre-screeners didn't give an estimated benefit amount, and that didn't really help a person decide if it was worth their time to apply. We also emphasized explaining the logic. So for when a user clicks, why did they get this result? We show all the logic of the 3 tests for SNAP eligibility that make up the eligibility components. And then we walk through all the math and all the steps of the benefit and let someone click through to discover more and more details so that they can understand the logic behind the outcome. So that was a brief tour of what we did. We did this work a long time ago. Man, memories coming back. Someone trying to figure some of this out. We worked on this and our project's funding ended in September 2020, so almost 2 years ago. And so we want to share out some things that have happened since. And interestingly enough, some things that we really can't take credit for. We got to give credit to amazing folks who pushed this work forward. So a couple of things we want to mention. A legal aid group in Virginia, the Virginia Poverty Law Center, took the JavaScript code that we had created for the rules as code and the pre-screener and embedded it onto their own website for use in helping Virginia households determine their SNAP eligibility. And pretty recently, actually, we got this information from Salam Bhatti, who's a legal aid lawyer in Virginia, who helped deploy the calculator to his website, reuse our code on VPLC's website. He told a story about how a single mom with 3 kids called up VPLC, and that household was getting only $90 for SNAP. But then when she ran her income and expenses through the calculator, she saw that she was supposed to get over $600. So that's a difference of more than $500 a month. And Salam, the legal aid attorney, notified the Virginia Department of Social Services. They said they'd contact her. And this person wrote back and said that the Virginia department had gotten them the correct benefit amount. That will change the amount her household is eligible for by over $500 a month. So we weren't sure, as Mike had mentioned in the beginning, what the impact of a pre-screener could be, but seeing this really made us understand how important it can be, especially when legal aid groups are using it and are integrating it into their work. But it's not just enough to have folks in the advocacy or nonprofit sector use your code. In fact, it could be dangerous if there aren't folks who are actively maintaining the code, keeping it up to date, because rules fall out of date pretty quickly. And we are also really, really happy and proud of some of the ways that folks have carried our work forward. And so I want to give a shout out to snapscreener.com, which is a project of Ben Moline. Ben, I think you're in the audience, so hi Ben, waving at you. We have to say here that we're not endorsing snapscreener.com, but we're showing how Ben, who is a civic tech coder, has taken our initial Snap prototype, reused it, and extended upon it and built it out in a huge way. So you saw our initial prototype calculator. Ben, who is a civic coder, part of the civic tech community, took that code and blew it out into a calculator for Snap that would cover every state and region and multiple programs beyond just SNAP, including WIC. And Ben did a huge amount of work to determine the factors, the SNAP factors in every state and region, and compile it in an open database. And to our knowledge, this is the only place that this data has been gathered in a machine readable way. So we started our model with just a few states, Ben gathered the data to be able to configure it for every state and region. And Ben also used all this data to then generate guides for SNAP eligibility per state, plain language guides that can help a household determine their eligibility. And Ben was kind enough to share some data that he'd gathered with us, and he ran the survey, got 138 responses from folks before and after using the screener about how likely they were to apply for SNAP. And we think this is really interesting data. Again, we weren't sure if a pre-screener was the right thing to build, but we are seeing over the years, multiple years after we built our initial tool, some data and evidence about how it is influencing people's decisions to apply for benefits in the real world. So I'll hand it over back to you, Mike, to talk about what's next.
Thanks, Alex. I know we're kind of pushing up against our time limit and we want to leave time for questions. So I'll try and hustle through this and stick the landing. We mentioned our project was a short experiment. Formally, it's over. We're working on other things right now. What are we doing? What are we advocating for here? Well, we really want to see federal benefits agencies distributing their eligibility rules, not only as text, but as open source code. This is something that Ariel mentioned in her intro. We are absolutely in support of that. We also want to see them doing so, next slide, please, with the support of and in collaboration with a broad audience of benefits experts, the people that really understand how these programs are implemented in the day-to-day. Many of you might be in the room right now. So we would love to see you and the federal government working in partnership on these things to figure out how best to distribute that information. Next slide. The overall rule here that we want to advocate for most strongly is that there are better methods than PDF to communicate complex logic, right? We believe that the federal responsibility for successful implementation of eligibility policy should go beyond providing huge PDFs that states then have to turn into code themselves. It should go beyond even providing funding and guidance. It's 2022 and there are better ways to do this than big bulky PDFs, especially when we all know that that logic has to make its way into digital systems. If federal agencies distributed their rules as open source code, it would increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of federal funding dollars. It would give states a better starting point, and it would go a long way to demonstrate a federal commitment to high quality service delivery. Our proof of concept demonstrated that a rules as code approach is possible. It even showed some immediate benefits of taking that approach. And we aren't even directly affiliated with benefits programs. So we would be really excited to see what happens if the federal benefits programs themselves explore and experiment with this approach. So next slide. We're all set and we would love to hear some questions.
All right, guys, thank you so much for kicking us off with that great presentation. I'd like to now open it up to the audience to ask any questions or share any comments that were sparked during the demo. Please use the raise hand function if possible, but if not, you are more than welcome to drop questions in the chat and I will field them to our presenters. I'd like to start actually with the question that was dropped in the chat during your presentation from Josh Schwartz from MITRE, who seemed surprised that appetite and comfort level for code rules engine approach was low amongst administering agencies, and wanted to know if that was true at federal, state, and local levels.
Alex, I'm happy to take a whack at that, and if you want to add in. Yeah, I mean, we didn't speak to every single federal agency and every single state, but keeping in mind that, Alex and I, as good as we could possibly be at this, we're just two people and Alex is the one that writes the code. So we're kind of one person doing this code. And what we were talking about doing is disrupting, eligibility rules engines that have, hundreds of people working on them and cost hundreds of millions of dollars and, deploy every 7 years or something like that. So, we, in retrospect, we probably shouldn't have been surprised that people weren't immediately like, oh yeah, you guys seem nice, let's do this. But, what we realized was that it was a new idea and there was appetite potentially for exploring ways to use it in a lower risk way, which is kind of how we pivoted to the pre-screener. Just another thing to note was also that a lot of this work was happening in the early days of the pandemic, and we had shifted some of our attention towards trying to partner at the state level. But, as you probably aren't surprised to hear, they had other things on their mind. And it was a challenging time to try and figure out where we could do a sort of long-term strategic experiment while all the states were really struggling with immediate triage of an absolute crisis.
Great. Mary Pat, I see that you have your hand up. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. I love this as a proof of concept. One question that I have for you is if this was written with consideration to make it easily translatable so that it would be accessible to people who speak something other than English, because that's another way to really get value out of proof of concepts like this, is to make it really easy to multiply its impact into other languages.
I can speak to this one. I think in the time that we had to prototype, we didn't have time to translate into other languages than English. That was an accessibility miss. I think with the time we had, we weren't able to do that, but I'm fairly certain that Ben Moline in his work with snapscreener.com has translated and made the calculator information available in multiple languages, including Spanish. So I think that's one really promising benefit of doing this work in the open, is that if one entity or one organization or one person can contribute translation into another language, then potentially every other user who uses the open source code base could benefit from that translation and expand accessibility. So I think a really natural benefit of potentially doing this at a more product approach across all states might be that, for example, if one state is able to translate the content into a certain language, maybe every state could benefit from that translation. So great point. Multilingual accessibility is super important.
Thank you for that, Alex. Dan Beebe, you're up next.
Thank you so much. This is great and really wonderful to see. And we run up against a lot of the same issues that you all are highlighting in this, like how to keep your code updated. And we are constant gardeners over at Benefit Kitchen. I guess the main question I had was, is this offered as a service anywhere? Is there an endpoint that people can use to do this, or do they download the code and run it themselves?
Ooh, I can take this one too. Great question. Our initial model involved endpoints, and maybe I'll try to translate this language too for folks who may not be developers. So for some of our initial models, we envisioned that different states could potentially call our servers, ask, for example, hey, is so-and-so person eligible? And our servers would give a response. We ended up moving away from that approach. And in particular, I think there are really important considerations that we needed to think about as the federal government. The federal government and states didn't always agree about the nuances of the SNAP program and how it can be administered. We have a federal system, and states have a certain role, and the federal government had a certain role to play. And so in some of the initial conversations, when we discussed ideas of a federal endpoint like that, we got some pushback, and we heard, hey, my state might not want to use that. You know, we administer our SNAP program. We might not want to surrender such a core thing as eligibility determination to the federal government in this instance. So that's a great question. That's another reason we ended up shifting so much of our work to client-side JavaScript. By doing it that way, the implementer, whether it's a state or a local government or a nonprofit organization, has full control of the outcomes, can modify the library, can choose to use or not use the library, can poke into the internals. And so federalism really influenced how we thought about those decisions. Mike,
Great.
do you have
I don't want to. That's an excellent answer. Thank you for that. And it's something we grapple with as well. The other, and I don't want to take too long, but one other question I would have is, how do we actually incentivize the government then to sort of step in and build something like this? And I'm sure this will come up throughout the day, but like, you know, we built and provided a code for a federal poverty level API to several agencies. We pitched it to them. Nobody was interested in running it. It was very simple. And just that one element alone, I think, would make a lot of this work a lot simpler for organizations downstream.
Yeah, that's the $1 trillion question there, right? You know, what incentivization sort of works? I mean, I think thinking through things as a federal employee, from the federal employee lens, a lot of it is about risk reduction. A lot of it is about predictability and sort of expected outcomes and things like that. And, you know, one of the reasons that our approach was, you know, a little bit, you know, raised some eyebrows maybe at first was because it wasn't tested adequately. And it would have been a real shift, including the pain of moving away from the existing systems. So I think, you know, advocating on all of those counts at the same time is a really an important thing to do. And I think there are other ways to demonstrate perhaps, you know, the advantages of a rules as code approach. Like one of the things that I've heard that really seems to resonate is the complexity of the code is such that even policy experts can't really hold it all in their head at the same time. But a rules as code approach can make that policy functional. Even if it's not deployed to end users in the public, it can help you actually understand the implications of the code, of the policy, and it can help you maybe even do sort of simulations as to sort of what would happen if you were to change the policy. And that's something that policy departments could be really excited about, working together with developers to sort of build a model of their rules, and then being able to sort of see the implications of it. And one of the things that we found recently was that you know, a federal agency had certain language on its a federal page around eligibility that were at odds with what the state eligibility language, the reality truly is. Now, they're not wrong because they are the federal elements of eligibility, but they're sort of preempted in each state by the state's language and the state's rules. And the way that it was, you know, written on this federal website, you could easily think that you weren't eligible for benefits that, because of state variation, you actually were eligible for. And that's a level of confusion that I think, you know, a benefits agency could actually take really seriously and understand that it's too much to ask people to navigate all of this complex PROS policy by themselves. So I think figuring out where those sort of leverage points are to demonstrate that this is an alternative approach, and to figure out, you know, leverage the way that those federal agencies make decisions, I think is a really important way to approach it.
Thank you both.
Thank you guys. We're going to go now to what will probably be our last question for this Q&A session. So once again, if you did not get to have your question asked, please put those in the collaborative document. Our last question comes from Shelby Switzer in the chat. They said, what do you think is necessary for a project like this to get more RUs? You mentioned y'all did marketing to civic tech groups. What do you think is needed in terms of more resources to do that, or tech support for groups like VPLC, documentation, et cetera, to increase reuse? Sorry.
I know Alex and I both have really strong feelings about this. I mean, this is a big question about just sort of the open source community in general. You know, it's not usually enough to just huck an open source code library into the community and just hope people pick it up. You know, like cultivating those relationships is a big part of it. Making sure that there is an eager participatory community around it is a huge part. If you look at tools like OpenFisca, for example, you know, which was something that we'll hear more about today, I'm sure, it's something that we couldn't exactly use just for a variety of reasons that aren't really worth getting into right now, but there's a huge community around and a huge excitement around that. People using that tool and working on it together, and you know, updating and keeping the code current through that. But I think, you know, from my perspective, one of the things that's really a leverage point here is just the fact that the federal government owns this policy, and really seeing the federal government take ownership over the interpretation of the policy, or at least responsibility for the fact that anybody can take code, can take policy and sort of interpret it into code, but only one entity really for each of these benefits is able to say that's official. And that's, I think, the real step that we need to take from our perspective as federal employees to try and push this forward. Alex, I'd love to hear your thoughts about nurturing that care as well.
Oh, yeah, maybe in like 10, 20 seconds. I think it's really interesting because there are so many stakeholders when you do work in the public sector, right? You want to put users first. We, as federal government, we needed to collaborate closely with other federal agencies and states to do this. And so it's kind of interesting, like, how do you drag one more stakeholder chair to the table, which is the open source community? It's an extra chair at the table, but it's really important. And I think we should give a shout out to Code for America's network, their volunteer tech network, which is how we connected with folks and shared some of what we were doing. So this is part of a bigger ecosystem.